Hey there, everybody. It's Richmond. We're going to shift gears a little bit today. We're going to start pushing away from Europe, at least just for a time. And we're going to see some of the stuff that's been going on in the New World, which is honestly an entire half of the planet we really haven't looked at all yet this year. I mean, most of what we've been doing has been in the Old World, so it's been in Africa, Asia, Europe. And we really have kind of avoided North and South America so far, and there's reasons why. But I mean, most of what we've been looking at has been literally on the other half of the globe. Today we're going to kind of begin to look at some of the events that are going on the other side, in the Western Hemisphere, and we're going to see a couple of very important civilizations there. So again, we'll change gears, but we're going to hop right back into at least pulling Europe back into our story for next week. So our big guiding questions for today: number one, what were the major achievements of the Aztec and the Inca? So these are going to be two New World civilizations that I'm sure you've heard of before. Today we're going to bring those back and just mention their importance within the overall world history story. The second question that's up there: how did culture and technology in the New World differ from that in the Old? One of the things that we'll see pretty quick here is that there's going to be some major cultural and technological differences, and also even some biological ones that we'll get to later on in this unit, between the New World and the Old World. So I'm calling this one the People of the New World because that's going to be our focus today. We're going to be focusing on a couple different people groups that are existing in North, Central, and South America. So, quick little geography here before we get started. As civilizations were developing in Europe and Asia, there was stuff that was going on in the New World. There were some very important achievements that were going on elsewhere, not just in Europe, in China, Middle East, things like that. So most of the time when we're talking about the New World, we're talking about any of these lands that Europe hadn't really discovered before 1492. So of course 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, and once this happens, then all of a sudden Europe is going to be very, very aware of what's been going on in the New World. But before that, they didn't really have any idea that these entire continents were over there. So when we use this term New World, we're mostly referring to North and South America. But keep in mind that it was really only new to Europe. So this idea of a new world, it's a very European-centric term. It's very European focused, is what I mean by that. So certainly to the Europeans, North and South America were new, but to the people who were already in the New World, it wasn't that new. I mean, there were many people, millions of people that had already lived there. So one of the areas in the New World that we're going to see a lot of important growth of civilizations is in this region that we call Mesoamerica. Now, Meso it's a prefix of a word. It always means middle. So if you think about, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the land in the middle of the rivers, Mesoamerica here means something similar. So you're talking about between the Americas. So Mesoamerica is another term that we can use to describe what is really Central America. It's that region that's in between North and South America. So usually it would be like Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, that whole region, pretty much until you hit South America. So if you take a look up at that map there, that's looking at that thin isthmus that we usually refer to as Central America, but we can also, especially in a historical sense, call it Mesoamerica. Now, it's in Mesoamerica that you're going to have a couple cultures that are going to be very, very important take root. And one of them is a good deal older than the other two that we're going to be talking about today. So the first is going to be the Maya. So the Maya were one of the first civilizations to really put down some good roots in Mesoamerica. There were a couple other cultures that existed before them, particularly a group called the Olmec. Which is often seen as like the mother civilization. It's kind of where it all got started. We don't really have time to talk too much about the Olmec, but let's kind of jump into the Maya here. So the Maya kind of hit their stride about 250 to about 900 AD, or really I should say CE. 250, just to put that into perspective, that's sort of right in the middle of the Roman Golden Age, the Pax Romana. So as the Romans are doing pretty well, the Maya are kind of getting their start. over in what is really today modern day Mexico. In fact, that little hunk of land that kind of bumps up into the Gulf of Mexico, we call that the Yucatan Peninsula. It's where you can find places like Cancun. That was the Mayan stomping ground for a very long time, and then later they'll shift south for some different reasons. But the Mayas are a pretty cool civilization. They're very skilled engineers. They're able to create amazing works of architecture, like the structure that you see up at the top of the screen there. It's a very famous Mayan pyramid known as Chichen Itza. So they build stuff like that. They do some incredibly detailed artwork. They do a lot of like stone carving, bas relief is what we call that. So they're building these massive pyramids. They did have a system of hieroglyphics. They're very skilled in astronomy, so studying the stars. They had a 365-day calendar. In fact, it's kind of funny. In fact, some historians have pointed out that maybe it's more than just a coincidence. But I mean, the Mayas are very similar to like Egyptian culture. You think about, building pyramids, writing in hieroglyphs, studying the stars, having a 365-day calendar. The Mayas are doing all the same kind of stuff, but half a world away. Now, the Mayas were mostly a peaceful culture, especially when we compare them to the Aztecs that we'll see next. And they certainly did have war, and they did fight amongst each other, but it wasn't as, violence was not as big of a piece of their culture as it will be for the Aztecs. Just to kind of give you a nice visual here, these are the ruins of Tikal. So Tikal was a Mayan city back in the day. It was one of many important Mayan cities. The Mayas were very much like Greeks in the sense that they lived in these independent city-states. In fact, some historians will refer to the Maya as the Greeks of the New World because, I mean, yes, they do live in city-states, but they've got a culture that's very sophisticated. It's very, education-based and art-based. It's very almost Athens in the New World. But again, they do a lot of city-state building. They're kind of off doing their own thing. And the Mayan civilization will do pretty well for a long time until it doesn't. And honestly, we're not entirely sure of all the reasons as to why the Mayan civilization will collapse, but it does. And it does kind of just in time for another group to come through. And this group is going to be known as the Aztec. So I really don't like that I say the Maya were wiped out there. The Maya weren't actually wiped out. It's not like just suddenly they were gone. And they never really completely fizzled out because technically there are still people who can kind of consider themselves to be Mayan today, although not in the same way that they could have 1,000 years ago. But the Mayan civilization at least gets replaced by a group known as the Aztec. Now, the Aztec are very similar to the Maya in a lot of ways. They have very similar architecture, very similar artwork, religion, culture. But there's a really, really big difference here, and that's the Aztecs are very much about violence. They're very much about war. They're a very militaristic society. They build their civilization on war and conquest right from the beginning. In fact, some of the earliest stories of the Aztec world, even before they build their first city, violence and bloodletting and all this kind of stuff is a huge piece of who and what they're going to become. So they end up building this pretty massive empire, which you can't really see because my big head is in the middle of the map here. But they build a pretty sizable empire. But they have a lot of enemies. And sometimes they'll just make up enemies when they don't have enemies because it's fun for them. And one of the things that they'll very often do is instead of just killing their enemies, they'll actually capture them. And when you get captured by the Aztec, they'll very often use these captives for sacrifice. Now, sacrifice is used in a lot of different religions. Actually, almost every religion has some form of sacrifice in it. And sacrifice in this case usually means to kill or to get rid of something as an offering to the gods or to God. And so one of the things that the Aztec would do, and you can kind of see it in the top photo there, is they would take captives and they would drag them up to the top of a very tall pyramid in their capital, which is a city called Tenochtitlan. We'll talk about that in just a second. But then a priest would come and literally tear open the chest of these victims, pull out their heart, and you can actually still survive for a couple minutes without your heart, which is terrifying. And then they would do this whole big thing where your blood would be fed to the gods and all that. And this was very, very important for the Aztec because they actually believed that the gods demanded blood, and without blood, if the gods weren't fed the amount of blood that they were demanding, they would actually keep the universe from existing anymore. So they would end the world right then and there. So the Aztec have this very strange, very bloody religion that drives their culture forward, and also drives their interactions with other groups. Again, if the Aztecs weren't at war with somebody, sometimes they would do these things called flower wars, where they would just run out and they would attack a village, even in a village that they were buddies with, take some of their captives and then peace out. And there wasn't really much you could do about it. So the Aztec are a very violent people, but believe it or not, they are actually still pretty cultured as well. And they build some amazing things, especially given the level of technology that they had at the time. So a lot like the Maya, the Aztec will build huge pyramids. They're far bigger than anything that the Maya will ever build. Unfortunately, unlike the Maya, and we have many Mayan pyramids still left, we don't have any Aztec pyramids left because they were torn down later by the Spanish. But we'll get there. Um, so the Aztec have all these great structures, but what makes it even more impressive is the Aztec homeland, like where the Aztecs actually originate from, is pretty miserable. They tended to develop around one particular lake in Mexico. It's called Lake Texcoco. It actually no longer exists. But back then it would have been this shallow, kind of salty, swampy lake. So it wasn't even good for water, but it's really where they start this whole thing. Um, but it's a lake, and you can't really build on a lake until the Aztecs get pretty smart. So what they start to do is they start to build these things called chinampas. And a chinampa is an artificial island. It's a fake island. It's a man-made island that they're going to build out of logs and mud, and I'll show you a picture in just a second. But it actually makes for really great agricultural soil. So it's great for farming, but if you put enough of them together, it's also great for building because you can build a huge structure on a flat surface in the middle of a lake. So once you start joining up all these bigger chinampas, you can start to build these big pyramids and things. You can build entire cities, and that's what we see with Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan is the capital of the Aztec world. It's built literally in the middle of Lake Texcoco. It was a beautiful city, this massive sprawling city that was, all created for the Aztecs by the Aztecs, and it's just built layer after layer on top of these chinampas. So it's very much a floating city, in the same way that Venice would be in Italy. So this is what I mean when I talk about these chinampas. What they would do is they would kind of put these posts into the ground. They would sort of like flatten them out and build these walls, and then they would just sort of dredge the soil at the bottom of the lake. They would grab it because it tends to be fertile, all the gunk that you find at the bottom of the lake, and then they pile it into these things. They let it dry out. They pat it down, and then all of a sudden you have these islands. And again, they're great for farming. And if you start linking them up and making them big enough, then you have these flat surfaces in the lake that you can now build on. And that's what they did, especially to build this. So this is an artist's version of Tenochtitlan. This would have been what the capital would have looked like back in the day. So Tenochtitlan, again, it was this massive city with all these bridges and causeways and canals. You could get pretty much anywhere by boat. And even the Spanish, once the Spanish show up, I mean, the Spanish think they're so much better in terms of technology and whatnot, and they are. But even they came to Tenochtitlan and they were like, this is amazing. This is a beautiful, incredible city. And so what happened to this city? Well, again, the Spanish. And we'll talk more about that next week. But when the Spanish show up, they will conquer this city, but they'll also destroy it. And so they'll level the city, they fill in the lake, and actually where Tenochtitlan was is now where Mexico City is today. So Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, the biggest city in Mexico, is actually built on the ruins of what used to be this Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which is sort of sad, because certainly the city itself, as it was absolutely incredible, but it no longer exists. So to kind of deal with the second half of this particular lesson for today, I mean, we've talked about these Mesoamerican cultures. So remember, both the Maya and the Aztec are hanging out in Mexico. The Maya will push a little bit further south into places like Guatemala. But that's not the only place that we see civilization in the New World, not just in Mesoamerica. We also see it down in South America. So south of Mesoamerica, you get into actual South America. And the western edge of South America is sort of dominated by one particular geographic feature, and that's the Andes Mountains. So you can see on that map there, you've got South America in the middle. That green area, that tends to be where we see this other group of people known as the Inca. But it's also all along the spine of South America there that we see this very sharp, very steep, very dangerous mountain range called the Andes. Now, the Andes are going to be the homeland of the Inca. So just like the Aztec, where they have a pretty crummy place to start, the Inca are going to do their own modifications to geography to really make it their home, to really make it a place where their civilization can grow. So the Inca themselves are a pretty major New World civilization based in what is today modern-day Peru. So like the Aztecs, again, they're going to be incredible engineers. They're going to build some amazing stuff. They'll build sprawling cities. They build road systems. And again, this is all high up in the mountains. And that's what makes these people so stinking impressive, is that even though their geography doesn't necessarily lend itself to being as great of a place as, say, like Mesopotamia over in the Middle East, the Incas are still going to do the best with what they have. And they're going to do some really cool stuff with it. Another map of South America there, you can see that lighter color. It pretty much shows you how the Andes Mountains work. They do run that whole spine of South America. And you can see that they're really kind of scary. A lot of mountain ranges over time will erode. They'll not be as sharp. They'll be a little less tall. The Andes Mountains, geologically speaking, are actually still pretty new. So they haven't had a whole lot of time to like wear down and erode in the same way that, like, you know, the Appalachians would. We're closest to the Appalachian mountain range, which aren't as big and rocky and snow-peaked because they're just so stinking old. They've worn down. Not so with the Andes. In fact, you can probably see they're really sharp. They're very, very steep. But this is going to be the Incan homeland. And part of what they're able to do is farm in this area. Now, you wouldn't think you could just farm on a cliff face like that, but they build these things called terraces. Not terrorists, that's different. Terraces are these steps of dirt that are created to build and farm on. So you kind of like, you build a wall, and then you like backfill it with dirt, and then you build another wall and backfill it with dirt, and then you have these little steps that make flat surfaces so that you can farm. So if it you know, you have a big rain, you know, big downpour, it's not going to wash everything away because it still has these flat surfaces that are almost like little mini pastures. And that's going to be very important. I'm sure you've seen that city that's over there, Machu Picchu. It's very, very famous. One of the few Incan cities that wasn't destroyed, again, by the Spanish. But it's still pretty well intact today. You can go visit it and you can see some of this incredible architecture. Speaking of incredible architecture, the Incas are crazy good with their stonework. The photo that I've got up there right now, this is Incan stonework. Now, if you think about like brickwork, or even, you know, if you have like a stone house or something like that here in the States, most of the time what you see in between pieces of stone is that really like thick cement, excuse me. So you have to have some sort of filler that like fills in those gaps. Notice how much mortar, how much cement you have here. You got nothing. These pieces are so perfectly cut that they just fit together like a puzzle. In fact, there's been some research done that has argued that the way that the Inca were able to cut their stone is better than we can do today with literally laser-guided diamond cutters. It's crazy how good they are with this kind of stuff. And what's even more impressive is that stonework is enormous. Like, these are huge chunks of stone that we're talking about. But here's the craziest part. The Inca did not have metalworking tools. They didn't have tools that were made out of metal. At best, they had stone tools, maybe bone tools, things like that. So they didn't have things like copper, bronze, iron, steel. And they also didn't have the big pack animals that we would have in the old world. So things like horses, oxen, these big animals that pull stuff around didn't exist for the Incas, which is one of these crazy things. It's like, how did they do all of this? Also very impressive about the Incas. I mean, beyond just their engineering stuff, they have a crazy complicated government. It was a very, very impressive system. It was highly centralized. All their power drew from one place. We also know that they had a really early and very effective form of socialism, which just kind of meant that the government took a lot of the extra stuff when things, when they had more than what they need. And if there was some sort of problem, like a drought or some sort of famine, then they would take all that extra stuff and they would give it out to the people so that people were taken cared for. It was a very good system of government. They had a very powerful emperor who would lead the whole thing. And their civilization was huge. I mean, if we backtrack to that map, it's a huge chunk of what is today the entire continent of South America, and they were able to maintain it. But not only were they able to maintain it, they were able to do it without a system of writing. Now, keep in mind, like if you're an emperor and you need to send a message halfway across your empire, easiest thing to do is to write it down. Or if you want to like get some information about an area, write it down. The Inca didn't have this option because they never actually developed a system of writing. Now, one thing that they did create is that little thing that we see kind of over there. That's called a quipu. And a quipu was a system of ropes and knots that somehow recorded information. We don't know how, but somehow they were able to take those knots and ropes and derive meaning from it. So in a sense, it is almost its own form of writing, where you tie these different knots at different locations. But honestly, today, to this day, modern historians have no idea how to read this. There's no one surviving today that understands how to read a quipu. We have some ideas, but it's a crazy system that's just been lost to history. So just to kind of wrap this up here, let's talk about what makes these New World civilizations so unique. So whether you're talking about the Maya or the Aztec or the Inca or the Olmec or the who else, there's some pretty interesting things that really went down within the New World. Culturally, technologically, they had no wheels. We think about a wheel being such a basic invention, and you think about how helpful it is, whether you're strapping it on a cart or a car or a wagon, a chariot, whatever. But the people of the New World never developed wheels. There's like one example that they've ever found of using wheels, and it was actually on a kid's toy. But these people never developed chariots, wagons, wheelbarrows, anything like that. So all the stuff, when you talk about these big hunks of stone that they're moving around, they did that all purely by human labor, no wheels to help them move things. Also, and I mentioned this earlier, none of these civilizations developed a real system of metalworking. They played with some softer metals like silver and gold, but never any bronze, tin, iron, copper, anything like that. They kept it pretty simple. So instead, I mean, what do you use for a sharp or a hard surface? You can use things like stone. Very often they would use this black volcanic glass called obsidian. But I mean, you think about that kind of stuff doesn't hold up the same way that metal does. So again, they're building this entire civilization without metal. Thirdly, they had no horses, they had no cattle, they had no camels, they had no oxen, they had no elephants. I mean, all these big domesticated animals that we associate with civilization did not exist. Literally, the only animal that they had domesticated beyond like dogs was the llama. And I mean, llama, they're miserable creatures. And you can't really ride a llama into battle. You can't really like get a llama to do all your dirty work for you. So they're very, very limited in the animal resources that they had. And then lastly, they also never developed gunpowder. So even well into the 1500s, when Europe starts building these big muskets and cannons and all this kind of stuff, they'd never even heard of gunpowder before. So again, you think about the level of sophistication that all these cultures had with their big pyramids and cities and all this beautiful artwork and whatnot that they create. They don't have these things that we so often associate with civilization. Wheels, metal, domesticated animals, gunpowder, all this kind of stuff. It just did not exist. And unfortunately, as we'll see in a few days, it's going to actually really hurt them in the long run, because what's going to happen when they do come up against a civilization that has wheels, that has horses, that has metal, and pretty terrifyingly has gunpowder? It's not going to be so good for the New World cultures. Closing thought before I leave you for today: the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas, the Olmecs, the Tlaxcalan, whatever, whoever we're talking about in the New World, remember they're all existing before the Europeans show up there. And so for this reason, we usually refer to these cultures as pre-Columbian. Pre-Columbian, pre meaning before, Columbian meaning Columbus. So before Columbus sails the ocean blue in, I'm really hoping you just said 1492, these cultures were already existing. So really anything before 1492 in the New World, we're going to call that pre-Columbian. So they existed before Columbus. And these cultures endured for centuries. I mean, Mayan history is over 1,000 years long. Again, you compare that to the United States, and we've been around for about 250 years, and we're doing real well. But what's so sad about this whole story is, despite how long these cultures had existed, once Europeans move into the area, all of these stories are going to come to a crashing halt. And you're going to see some major changes in terms of the civilizations that exist in the New World. And so on that happy, depressing, awful, whatever note, I'll leave you guys. Hope all is well. Don't forget, you're always welcome to check in with me. Email, phone. My office hours are now on Teams completely, from about 1 o'clock to 2:30 or 3 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. And we'll see you all soon. Have a good one, guys.